perhaps even his education at Oxford University, where he studied philosophy, politics, and economics. I could rattle off the long list of books that he has authored, among them Pirates of the Caribbean, Axis of Hope, Conversations with Edward Said, Clash of Fundamentalisms, Crusades, Jihads on Modernity, A Banker for All Season, or his latest work, The Obama Syndrome, Surrender at Home, War Abroad. A very limited supply of these are available outside in the lobby. I could easily share with you the long list of his outstanding achievements. For example, owning his own independent television production company, Bandung, which produces programs for Channel 4 in the UK during the 1980s. Or that he is a regular broadcaster on BBC Radio and contributes articles and journalism to magazines, newspapers, including The Guardian and the London Review of Books. Or that he is the editorial director of London publishers Verso and is on the board of the New Left Review, for whom he is also an editor. However, what makes Mr. Tariq Ali so exceptional is the conviction with which he lives the values and principles of his very being. Born to a journalist father and activist mother, Tariq learned from a very young age to challenge the legacy of British colonial rule and the military dictatorship that followed in Pakistan. His determination for the struggle against oppression eventually forced him to immigrate to England, where he continued his activity as the first Pakistani elected president of the Oxford University Student Union. While in student politics, his principles led him to become involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam. And during this time, he engaged in many debates, one of them even with Henry Kissinger, which brought him significant political recognition. Finally, what makes Mr. Tariq Ali even more extraordinary is that he recognizes that he is a human being like any other, worthy of dignity and respect. It is from this premise from which he creates and contributes his wonderful works to the world in order to influence us all to continue building the world that we want to be. Ladies and gentlemen, students and staff, friends, family, the entire community, I give to you today, Mr. Tariq Ali.
Dear friends, I'm very happy to be here, and someone asked me, why did you come to Alberta? In a nice way. And the answer I gave was, I came to Alberta because by and large, though I get a lot of invitations from all over the world every month, I like and make it a priority to talk to young people and students for very obvious reasons, that they're the future. And especially now that we live in times where, despite all the talk of globalization, one effect of this globalization has really been to make cultures and countries much more provincial than they were before globalization. So while it is the case that capital and the rule of capital has spread to most parts of the world, the actual level of knowledge, historical knowledge, cultural knowledge, has been reduced considerably, which is why events like this that work against the grain are extremely important today, and that is why I accepted the invitation, for which many thanks, and for the kind words said about me. What I'd like to do today is to discuss essentially two interrelated things. One, what is happening to democracy itself as a political philosophy, as a political process. And secondly, how this interacts and interrelates with the Wall Street crash of fall 2008, which has cast a shadow over the world ever since, and which we are still living through. It is by no means over. And the impact that this has on different parts of the world and different continents. So 2 points I would like to start off with, before moving to what has been happening over the last few years. I think the first thing it is important to just stress that what happened in the late 90s was the collapse of one alternative to capitalism. That was the Soviet Union and that set of states allied to it, which had existed for 70 years. And after 70 years, they imploded. They did not have to be invaded by anyone. They were not removed with violence. People in these countries lost faith in the system and refused to back it. And the choice was to carry on ruling by force or to give up. And the leaders that be gave up. And most of the elites that had ruled these countries gave up for a very good reason. That they then sold state property to themselves and became the new millionaires and billionaires and oligarchs who traveled the world today, and many of whom are wanted for corporate crimes in several continents. That is essentially what happened. But leaving aside that system for a moment, the result of that was a huge triumph for capitalism. The tragedy was that the world was left with a place without any alternatives. People felt that was it, and not just intellectuals or academics or students, but by and large, ordinary, common, laboring, working people felt all over the globe that this was it and nothing more could be done, and for a while, despair was the most common emotion. People said, what's the point of doing anything when we will achieve absolutely nothing? Look what, the Russians couldn't do it. How can we do anything? And so the world began to grow up in a different way, or continued to grow, but now with this break in a different way, that we were told that there were no alternatives left. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who once said that a world in which Utopia was removed from its map would not be a world worth living in, many years ago. And that utopia disappeared. And I mean utopia in the best sense of the word. Idealism, thinking forward, imagining a better world for everyone to live in. But side by side with the collapse of communism, something else happened. That social democracy, as we knew it, also disappeared. By social democracy, I mean the traditional social democratic parties of Europe. There was no social democratic party in the United States. In Canada, you had and you still have, the NDP, which was modeled on those parties. But by and large, these parties lost faith in their own beliefs and systems. The most glaring way in which that happened was in Britain under Tony Blair, who did it so effectively that New Labour was a seamless development from Thatcher and British conservatism. No differences, either economically or in foreign policy, or even in social policies on many levels. Now, what I want to discuss with you today is a very great book that was written by a great scholar whose daughter, I think, is still alive and lives in Ontario. And I'm talking about Karl Polanyi, the great economist and sociologist of Polish origin who lived in the United States for most of his life, and who almost 60 years ago wrote a book called The Great Transformation. One of the seminal books, I think, about capital and the world. I mean, of course, Karl Marx's volumes on capital are still regarded as seminal, even by people who disagree with him, because he analyzed the system better than most, which is why he's being read again and is on the bestseller list in Germany, for one. But Karl Polanyi tried to synthesize a lot of what had already been written in order to devise a program for a world in which he said a lot could be done provided that the state acted as a regulator and the free market was not given unlimited rein. And I read this again before, or refreshed my memory before coming here. And I just want to start by explaining to you what Polanyi argued when he called for state protection against the satanic mills of capitalism. He basically, and this, remember, is 60 years ago, over 60 years ago, delineated three domains, three fictitious commodities created by capital. None of these commodities, while existing on the market, were actually produced for sale, which is why he called them fictitious commodities. What were these? Labor power. And Polanyi described it as such, that labor, he wrote, and I quote, is only another name for a human activity that goes with life itself, which in turn is not produced for sale, but for entirely different reasons. The second fictitious commodity he wrote about was land. And he said, land is only another name for nature, which is not produced by man. And the third fictitious commodity he wrote about very presciently was money. And he wrote, actual money is merely a token of purchasing power, which as a rule is not produced at all, but comes into being through the mechanism of banking or state finance. He argued that once these fictions established a stranglehold on the dominant ideology of the world's capitalist rulers, they were capable of destroying all sustainable existence. And he went on to explain how. He said, stripped of protection, by which he means protection by the state and protection by governments. He said, stripped of protection, human beings would perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as victims of acute social dislocation. And of course, there are many parts of the world, many continents where this happens and carries on happening. And if you want to ask what is the principal reason for immigration, migrations, it is this. It is the economic conditions in which people live, or in which they cannot live any longer, that forces them to move. And this is true today, as it was true hundreds of years ago, when North America was colonized by migrants from Europe. The reasons are not dissimilar, though they are more exaggerated now, given the enormous growth, population growth that we have experienced. Polanyi talked about nature, and here too he was very prescient. Nature would be reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, military safety jeopardized, the power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. Well, very few serious ecologists or serious politicians would dispute that. And the third thing he said was, of course, the most prescient, relation to money. Shortages and surfeits of money would prove as disastrous to business as floods and droughts in primitive society. And the Wall Street crash, of course, can be seen in that light. Now, if we look at these predictions, what has happened? In terms of labor, working shorter hours, being better organized, having more protection, what has happened is in fact the opposite. Labor has grown globally. In 1980, the number of workers working in factories and industry was under 1 billion. By 2000, they had grown to 1.5 billion. By 2010, 10 years after the privatizations in Eastern Europe and Russia and the Chinese move towards capitalism, the number of laborers had actually trebled from 1980 to 3 billion. So you had deindustrialization in the West and a reduction in the workforce in the Western world, with traditional industries like steel and coal mining being destroyed or found too unprofitable. That's the better way to put it. And car industries caught in a trap of massive overproduction without being able to find a market for these cars, domestically and globally. So there was a reduction in the labor force in Europe, but not on a global scale. And what are the conditions in which these workers labor in China, in India, and parts of South America still? One has to say that they are as harsh as they were in Europe in the 19th century, especially China. And when I read a lot of the postmodernist novels being written in China about wealth and individuals having a good time, you really yearn for the birth of a Chinese Charles Dickens, to actually write about that society like Dickens wrote about Victorian England and describe exactly what is going on there. So nature, of course, remains unpredictable. And here, Polanyi is being vindicated even more than he would have liked to be. Its capacity to seriously threaten the stability of the system is now beyond dispute. It's just accepted. Ecological catastrophes that threaten the planet have failed, however, to move or stir the rulers of the world. No really common preventive programs except those of a cosmetic variety. Because in order to even seriously think about changing the way in which the world functions, you have to come up with very radical solutions, which mean, in some cases, a reverse of what has been taking place. This is slowly beginning to be understood, but not fully. I give you just one small example. The motor car. When the car was invented, and when it went into sort of massive production in the car plants of Michigan in the United States, and the inventor of the Ford motor car gave his name to an economic way of producing them, Fordism, factory line production, cars come. What people failed to notice was that the lobbies and the power of these new car millionaires at the same time meant the destruction of the railways. Ecologically, the soundest way of traveling still. Destroyed systematically in the United States and subsequently in parts of Europe. This now, some are realizing, some politicians are realizing that this is really not a viable option. And not just did they do that, but they really victimized rail by providing subsidies and help to moving stuff by trucks and huge trucks, which wrecked many a village in Europe, rather than using railway stations in order to help this industry. Well, that has been a total disaster. And there is a slight shift here in trains, but yet once again, the trains, the high-speed trains that float through Europe, France in particular, but also Spain to a certain extent in Germany, are incredibly expensive. So people with little money cannot afford to travel in them, certainly not spontaneously by hopping on a train 2 hours before it leaves, but by booking 2 months in advance. But at least it's some understanding that change is going to be necessary. The capitalist corporations and the politicians they sustain are united against labor, but they're seriously divided on the question of nature. Probably, if I can put it so strongly, against nature. They feel they live for today. They fight for present-day profits instead of even thinking in terms of what long-term gains would be. And the result is proving deadly for the ecology of the world. I mean, it is impossible for every single citizen in this world to live the American dream of the 50s, which is what they wanted to do. I mean, the United States itself can't live that dream any longer. So the notion that every family can have 2 or 3 cars, 2 refrigerators, this, that, and the other is not on, simply because the resources of the planet on which we live will not be able to sustain it. The answer here, then, is also radical, which is why they run away from it. And the answer, of course, is some form of democratically agreed planning. Globally, on a global level, and on a national level. Here you had a chance for the Europeans to do it. When they first set up the EU, the European Union, there was a lot of talk about creating a social Europe, which was very different from anything in the past. But the French politician who devised the term social Europe was soon removed, and Europe became essentially a banker's Europe. And here we come, if we just return to Polanyi's 3 fictitious commodities, money remains the weakest link. And this we saw in 2008. And that problem has not been solved. It's just that sticking plaster has been put on it. The blind expansion of credit, US impermanent debt, Europe paralyzed by cheap Asian imports, tectonic shifts in the real economy masked by all this fictitious money. And the question still remains now, will global supply exceed global demand? Intensifying the strain on the system, will China face its first big crisis since it went capitalist? What effect is that going to have? The continent in which Polanyi's prescriptions have been applied to a certain extent and with careful thought is South America, where the Bolivians, the Venezuelans, the Ecuadorians, even the Paraguayans, to a certain extent the Brazilians, the largest country there, have attempted to use the state to regulate capital. And with positive results, huge growth of education amongst the poor, free education, free health systems being created, things that were considered normal and necessary in the West after the Second World War, but are now considered unacceptable, forbidden, not permitted, because they challenge the rules, today's rules, are in fact being carried out in parts of South America. Argentina more or less defaulted on its huge debt, refused to pay the debt that it had accrued. And these lessons have not been learned by the Europeans. I mean, today, and this brings me to the second point I wanted to discuss, which is democracy. Now, democracy really only functions well when there is diversity of thought and opinion. And this diversity of thought and opinion is reflected in society, its political culture, its culture as a whole, its media networks. And increasingly what we have seen, particularly over the last 2 decades, the opening decade of this century and a bit before that, is things moving in exactly the opposite way. I mean, you can go to country after country in what are called the homelands of democracy. And what do you see? you see political parties with no fundamental differences on substantive issues. Cultural differences, yes. Differences on matters of sexuality, on reproductive rights, yes. But in terms of how the society as a whole should look or could be taken, basically no differences at all. And this is now emptying democracy or democratic states of the content. They're hollowed out processes. A hollowing out is taking place. Democracy is increasingly becoming a shell, and an empty shell. Because if you say to people, really there's nothing we can do, and you say that whether you're center-left or center-right, or left of the center-left, that we have to go and make wars, we have to occupy countries, we have to run our countries in the interest of the banks and the corporations, we can't do anything else, then what are you offering them? Nothing. Which is why the number of young people voting is declining in virtually every country. Almost every country. The last 3 general elections in Britain, a majority of those between the ages of 18 and 26 didn't vote. And that is the reason for it. And the revival of this democracy cannot simply be done from below. Of course, people have to be active and should be active and demand changes and more democratic electoral systems which actually reflect what the population feels and thinks. But all that needs to be done. But as far as the political rulers of the world today are concerned, they're not that interested in these processes. The 9/11 was used as a pretext actually to clamp down on civil rights and civil liberties, not just of terrorists or people who were called terrorists or could be called terrorists, but of American citizens. I mean, it's astonishing how little protest there has been to Obama signing a bill whereby the president has the right to order the execution of an American citizen at will, without due process of the law. Something that that Eisenhower, Nixon, and probably even Reagan would have found it pretty hard to do. But they're doing it. The way people who provide information that can only enhance democracy are being attacked, so-called whistleblowers, and locked up without trial. Everywhere that is going on. And no one cares. Citizens stay at home. They feel they can't affect this or are scared. The level of surveillance in society has grown phenomenally. The Pentagon very openly says that how the media is used when the Western powers are waging war is utterly crucial to the success of the operation. And the last we saw of that was in Libya, where a 6-month bombing campaign was hardly reported on the television screens, and you barely saw any images of what is the effect of this bombing on people below. Now slowly it's leaking out that this war waged to prevent a so-called massacre actually ended up killing between 25 to 30,000 people themselves. And all this debases democracy. The Chinese are at least honest. They have absolutely no interest in democracy whatsoever and have a thriving capitalist system. And of course, some people say in private, why don't we just follow the Chinese model, dump democracy and labor rights and all these things? They're not of great interest to us, and do what the Chinese are doing. Look how their economy is growing. I've with my own ears heard millionaires in Texas saying that at one of my talks. That is the degree of the shamelessness. So all this is going on at a critical time when we need the exact opposite. And so what I feel is happening is that we're being ruled in many parts of the world now in the Western world especially, by what I call the extreme center. I mean, people talk of an extreme right, an extreme left, but we actually have an extreme center now governing the world, which encompasses center left and center right, and which does horrible things on many different levels. It wages war against the poor at home, against its so-called enemies abroad, for its own interests, and people outside the extreme center are desperate to be part of it, political parties, because they feel that without going in there and accepting all its premises, they cannot be effective politicians. I mean, I used to have quite a number of friends in the NDP 25, 30 years ago, many fewer now. Because of this failure for politicians and political parties to actually fight for what they believe in. And the number of politicians you meet who in private say, well, yes, we agree with you, but you know, I say, but if you agree, why don't you say it in Parliament? You know, why keep quiet? Why not tell the truth? What more can you get? And in some parts of the world, people only go into politics now to make money. Literally. I mean, you know, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at Pakistan, if you look at parts of Europe, a lot of politicians get rich when they go into politics. Some get rich while remaining in politics. Others get rich when they help corporations while they're in politics and then join their boards to get their loot when they've left politics. So same difference, really. Politics equals money, and the higher you are in politics means you get more money. That is the world which young people are challenging. The occupation movements which have developed, though they didn't have clear programs, they didn't set out to have them, were an attempt to it was a scream for help, saying we can't face this anymore, help us somebody. But there's nobody out there unless you help yourselves. It's not going to, it's not going to work. And so, at long last, a discussion is beginning. Slowly, episodically, different in different parts of the world, but people are beginning to say that unless we do something, no one else is going to do it with us. And this became very pronounced last year during what has been called the Arab Spring. When the Tunisians and Egyptians took their future in their own hands and decided to topple their dictatorships and succeeded in doing so. Now, that is a very important event for the development of political self-confidence and political consciousness for a whole population. So when people say to me things in Egypt have not turned out so good, that's true. The military is still in power. The old system hasn't been really got rid of. One figurehead is gone. It's the same in Tunisia. But the fact that they were toppled in the way they were toppled, despite the wishes of their Western backers, that is what's important, because it means if they've done it once, they can do it again. And that is a threat which previous regimes in that part of the world did not face. And usually, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, it is better, however awful things may seem, to allow these developments to take place organically. Not for the West to send in its bomber jets, and only in some cases, because they send them in where they don't like a regime and where they think they can make a quick killing financially. They don't do it in countries which are even more oppressive than where they've done it, like Saudi Arabia, for instance. No one even talks about that. One of the most repressive regimes in the world today, which is then permitted to send its troops into Bahrain to crush a popular uprising and to try and sectarianize it. So what happened in the Arab world is interesting on many levels. One, it shows that the old ways, people said to me, but don't you think it would never have happened without texting and Vodafone and Facebooks. I said, well, look, you know, these were all helpful. I'd be the last person to deny that. But people have historically, through the centuries, found ways of communicating with each other to topple their leaders when it became necessary. If you look at what the slaves in Haiti did, how they organized the Haitian Revolution, they didn't have any means of communication except drums. And the messages used to go out by drum beats from one village to the other. Tomorrow's the day. That's when we're striking. Or during the great Indian Rebellion of 1857, when messages were sent from one part of India to the other, we're organizing this uprising against the British, this is when we are launching it. In chapatis, bread, local bread, messages were sent, so people opened them, got the message. Pigeons were used during the French Revolution. So, fine, and the world is advanced, technology is advanced. The key thing is not the means of communication, but the aims of the movements that were trying to topple this. And I remember after 9/11, the rubbish that was written in so many parts of the world, the Western world in particular, to the effect that Muslims are genetically hostile to democracy. I'm not kidding. I read articles more or less saying that the Muslim religion doesn't really encourage democracy. But which religion does, if we're talking about religions? But what does it have to do with religion? But people believed it. They're different from us. Very similar to the anti-Semitic propaganda of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Very similar, these attacks on Muslims. They're different, they do this, they have a different day of worship, they have a different diet, etc., etc. I've been looking at some of the things that are being said. Muslims are all prone to terrorism, the Jews were all prone to Bolshevism. And the ones who weren't Bolsheviks were millionaires, just like the Arab millionaires today. So, you know, all these arguments have been used before. They can't be used against the Jews any longer because it's just impermissible, but they are used against Muslims. And that Arab uprising actually decreased the power and weight of that particular idea that Muslim citizens in Muslim countries actually quite enjoyed being ruled by dictators. That went. And that is very positive, because what is interesting is that the occupation movements in Europe and North America said, we are occupying like the kids did in Tahrir Square in Cairo. And that was the best form of internationalism, to recognize that the idea was spreading from elsewhere and they were doing it in their own ways. But, and this is how I would like to conclude, there is no running away from politics. Even in difficult times, when political alternatives don't appear obvious, they have to be found. Because it's no good moaning as people do, oh, but look, in Egypt and Tunisia, it's the Islamist parties that have won. Yeah, they have won because they were organized, they had political ideas. I don't agree with them. They're socially conservative ideas, like the Christian Democrats in Europe. But they've won because there was no alternative party. And you can't just have a Facebook party. You have to have something on the ground that works and that has an alternative, and that will emerge, I'm confident, in these countries, which has an overall perspective of the world and of their own country. And that will happen. It's happened before, and I'm very confident that it will happen again. And I think a starting program, you know, one could learn a lot from Karl Polanyi, who labored away in the snows of Vermont over 60 years ago to produce this great work, and we can learn a great deal from it. Because, you know, I'm not one of those who believe that the ideals of socialism are dead and gone. No, they failed once, and we abandon them. Why? Capitalism has failed, 60 times. And people go on with it as it is, and now it gets worse and worse. So these are things which I think you have to think about, especially those of you who are going to be involved and engaged in years to come here and in different parts of the world. The world never really stays static. It either gets worse or it gets better. At the moment, it looks as if it's getting worse, but it's not totally the case. It's more mixed than that. And if democracy is to be sustained and fought for as a system, then it needs alternatives. Because, it is a good question which many young people raise. If voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. Many young people say that. But, you fight to prevent it being abolished by coming up with ideas, arguments, the creation of new movements of a different sort, movements which can function in today's world, which have learned the lessons of previous mistakes and defeats, and move on. And if we can begin to do that, then I think the future will not be as bleak as some people imagine it to be. And you must understand that hope is a very active emotion. If you hope for something, it makes you active. Whereas despair makes you passive. It's a very passive emotion. And in this struggle between despair and hope, I'm strongly, in all my life, I have been on the side of hope, and I still am. Thank you.